Hello again and welcome back. This is video 2 of our lead book study on our Reader's Handbook that we have here. Before I get started, if you have not been able to see the first video in regards to this lead book study, I highly recommend that you watch that first. Video 1 has to deal with persuasive writing and reading persuasive writing. We are talking about reading nonfiction in the content area, so and teaching reading in that content area. So I highly recommend reading or watching that video first. If you need a link to it, you can find it below this video, and I recommend that you watch that first. But this video is going to talk about the next section that it goes over in the nonfiction chapter, and it talks about focusing on speeches. And as I mentioned before in the first video, I had figured and predicted that it was going to focus even more on persuasive writing, and that's what it does. Really, the difference between this a speech and persuasive writing is the fact that a speech is spoken. But also, what I really like about this section is how its one goal, its last goal specifically, is designed to have students recognize common propaganda techniques. And this is a whole section and unit study in social studies by itself. And it's going to be very useful for any student learning to read nonfiction. It's a perfect little lesson for them, and this is one of the reasons why I want to go over this section of the nonfiction chapter. So, but before we go into that, let's just go over the basic goals. Like I said, I anticipated that it was going to go over persuasive writing, so it says sharpen your critical reading and thinking skills. So once again, thinking critically while you're listening or while you're even reading it. Understand how the speech is organized, which they go over that. It does mainly say here to focus on the three main parts of a speech. Once again, introduction, evidence supporting it in the body, which once again, like persuasive writing, those three main points, speeches are probably going to be doing the same. The only difference is that the viewpoint is going to be stated several times, which I think is something that gets overlooked in speeches, mainly because that speech giver is always going to try to drive their message home, and to do that, they're going to have to restate their viewpoint. So it defines that as one of the parts to look for when a student is reading a speech given. So I like how it identifies that as separating itself from persuasive writing, even though that's what it is. But when it comes to actual, the last goal, which it says focus on propaganda techniques, I mean, I think that's probably the most useful part of that section, mainly because students are going to be analyzing that, how it was reflected on government, what the general populace's responses are to that, everything from political convictions falling in the political spectrum, which was my second video strategy for this class, and I think that's going to be the most useful part for any student trying to learn how to read a speech. Mainly what to listen for as well, because speeches are always usually, as we know, of course, they're speeches, they're spoken. So it's going to be something that they're going to have to listen for. So the common propaganda techniques that it lays out or lists out is bandwagon, where everybody agrees, everybody else agrees with what everyone else is doing. Stacking the deck, where only the good side is mentioned and unfavorable facts are just left out completely. Every speech giver, especially politicians, uses this in some way, shape, or form, and for a student to identify this, once again, it goes back to its other goal of critical reading and critical thinking skills. This is really going to be in there more, I think, than persuasive writing, because you're listening for it, and it could be either subtly put in there or subtly just taken out and just slightly referenced to, which is why I think reading speeches and also listening to them is actually, I think, a little bit tougher. Plain folks appeal, which is the common everyday, people support it, or the average, what we call bourgeoisie or middle class, is going to support something. So if it has that kind of appeal, you can expect a plain folks appeal. Students could probably see this in probably early speeches of Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, or Vladimir Lenin, because they tried to appeal to the middle class when they were going through their revolutions and their coups. Another one is broad generalization, which are broad statements that have little to nothing to do with the viewpoint at all. So there's usually that kind of propaganda that literally will be like, what is this person talking about? They're just broad statements that, add little to, or there's very little evidence to support it. Snob appeal, which is mainly for the upper class. Only the tops echelons are going to really support it or agree with it. If it needs that kind of appeal, usually you can look at the audience, and that's going to be a big giveaway. It does not mention that, but which I think it would benefit if it did, by just audience observation. I think that would be beneficial for a reader, or to notice that when listening or reading a speech, to identify between plain folks appeal and snob appeal. Next is circular thinking, where the conclusion is simply a restatement of the introduction and the viewpoint, or restates the beginning. And circular thinking happens, I think, almost in every speech. So it could cut time, I guess. I don't know. But the other one is loaded words. Words that have strong emotional associations, such as mother, family, patriotism, tribalism, all of the isms that you can think of. It goes over literally what I think are every single propaganda technique that would be used in a speech to try to drive a point home. And I believe it's important for the reader to identify this when reading a speech or listening to it. So this is, I think, is the best section. Other than this, I read this, and I see it as kind of a rehash of persuasive writing. Not that that a student probably doesn't need to look at it as that, and probably needs to be retold it. But the propaganda techniques are what take the cake here, and more is devoted to it than any other section in this section of nonfiction reading, which is good. And another reason why I enjoyed reading this part of the text. One other thing that I really like, it gives examples of more examples of loaded words at the end, and because loaded words are something that we can really identify anything with, anything from words like God to dangers to but words that have a lot of meaning to us. And getting a student to really identify with that, make a connection with it, and they can identify really what their convictions are going to support. I think this is important than anything, because students need to be able to think for themselves. They need to be able to develop their own opinions when it comes to free elections, when it comes to making their opinions on what laws need to be passed. Their voice, this is a democracy, their voice can be heard. So teaching them that process in a civics lesson, and any U.S. history lesson where the Constitution is taught, it drives that home. And looking at some of the greatest speeches in the world, I looked up on a website. It was an opinionated article, but it gave the list of like top 10 best political speeches ever made. On there was Dr. Martin Luther King, his "I Have a Dream" speech. I think that was number one. Number two was Kennedy's "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." Roosevelt's speech on their the Day of Infamy after Pearl Harbor. I think that was on there as well. Reagan's speech for tearing down the Berlin Wall. He was on there twice for that speech and also for the speech after the Challenger exploded. So, but in there is everything from a sympathetic speech to rallying, persuasive kinds of speeches, bandwagoning speeches, plain folks appeal speeches. Roosevelt's New Deal speeches on there as well. All of it goes over that propaganda, one type at least, propaganda technique, and that is important for a reader to identify, and also for them to identify it when they're studying historical context, what they want to believe, what they envision for a governmental future within their livelihoods. That's the whole reason for studying social studies. And it's also the whole reading for reading it as well. So once again, a great section. I kind of unloaded on the propaganda techniques, but I think that's the best part. So if you have a chance to read that, please do. Once again, the text is entitled "Reader's Handbook" by Laura Robb. I am citing her at the end of this in the credits, so you can see that there if you're interested. If you do not have a copy of this, I'll be happy to scan some copies of the pages for you and send them to you on this specific section. If there's any other questions that you may have, I am going to attach my email address at the end of this video. I don't think I did in the other one. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. So I hope you enjoyed this addition to our lead book study. I hope you have a chance to take a look at the third one.